I am Inspector, and I solve mystery. Welcome to my new case.
I remember that morning with a kind of colorless clarity, as if the frost itself had etched it into my mind. The stones of Oxford were white-edged and faintly gleaming, a fragile skin of ice that made the city look older, or perhaps younger than it ever does in summer. I stood at the corner of Broad Street, the Bodleian rising behind me like a half-remembered cathedral, and felt the remnants of last night's whiskey making a slow, familiar circuit through my veins. The hangover was not unpleasant. It was a dull companion to the headline folded under my arm. The article was brief and curiously bloodless. A boathouse on the edge of Port Meadow, charred in appearance, but, the report said, strangely cold to the touch when the fire crew arrived. No injuries mentioned. No suspects. Only a line about chemical residue in the water that the journalist had not troubled to explain. I tried to picture it. Ash without heat, timber blackened but not smoldering, and some nameless figure standing there before dawn, watching their secret burn like a reversed photograph. Above me, a bell tolled a muffled note. Students hurried past in scarves and dark coats, their voices dampened by the air. One, a pale young man with a book balanced on his palm like a chalice, brushed too close and murmured something half-audible, not with a bang, but a whimper. I caught the misstep and stored it away. T.S. Eliot had always been a trap for the hurried or the vain. The boy's accent turned the final word into something even more threadbare. It meant nothing yet, but such errors sometimes reveal more than they conceal. I turned my collar up and tried to summon a sense of duty. On my desk at home, no doubt curling at the edges by now, lay an opera ticket purchased in a moment of hope. Verdi, a minor seat, a minor evening. I had not gone. Some cases, or rather some lives, accumulate around you until music feels like an intrusion. The thought of the empty seat, its cushion regaining its shape after the audience settled, was a small, sour pang. A gust of wind lifted the newspaper's corner and exposed the photograph. The boathouse, or what remained of it, crouched at the river's edge like a ruined rook. Frost on the reeds, frost on the water, but no steam, no smoke. Only a headline about a mysterious blaze that wasn't a blaze at all. I felt the dull pleasure of a puzzle forming. Not excitement, never that, but the tensing of a muscle long trained. A porter from one of the colleges nodded at me in passing. He had once given me directions to a cloistered staircase after a late dinner, and his expression now was the same, courteous secrecy. Oxford thrives on it. In the silence between footsteps, I could hear the faint ticking of some unseen clock, or perhaps only my pulse, coaxed louder by the cold. I walked toward the Sheldonian, letting my shoes find the patches of dry stone between slick ones. My mind tried to assemble a story from the fragments. A cold, fire, an unused opera ticket, a misquoted poet. 3 unrelated notes, perhaps, or the opening chords of something still hidden. I wondered who had telephoned the fire brigade and what voice had announced the emergency. Voices matter. The intonation of a word can betray a mood or an alibi. At the edge of Cat Street, I paused under the shadow of a gargoyle whose face had been worn smooth by centuries of weather. I thought of the boathouse again, of the river sliding past it like a dark, unlit corridor. If the fire produced no heat, then it had been meant not to destroy, but to disguise. Chemical packs can char wood without flame. I had read about such things once, idly in a police journal. The idea returned now with the same faint chill as the frost on the stones. Behind me, the student's voice echoed faintly in memory, not with a bang, but a whimper. I corrected it in silence. Whimper, the small sound of pain or surrender. It was the sort of mistake people make when they are distracted, or when the word they really mean is something else entirely. The light shifted as the sun rose, a pale disk behind low clouds. My headache softened but did not leave. I folded the paper, tucked it into my coat, and began to walk back toward my car. Port Meadow would still be rhymed in white. The boathouse would still be cold, waiting for someone to notice what had not yet been said. In the rear-view mirror of my mind, Oxford spires blurred like thoughts one tries not to recall, and I felt that quiet, familiar ache of a case beginning before it has even been named. 700 words, give or take, a memory laid down like frost. Lewis drove with the window half open despite the cold. He liked the air moving against his face, he once said, as though it might carry away the smell of cases before they reached his lungs. I sat beside him with the newspaper folded to its photograph. The boathouse lay ahead of us, somewhere beyond the frost-dusted hedges, on the fringe where the meadow met the river like two muted pages. My headache from the previous night had softened into a kind of watchfulness. The empty opera ticket stayed behind on my desk like an accusation. As we turned off the main road, a thin mist rose from the grass, making the college buildings seem to float. St. Cuthbert's had always felt to me like an annex of the older universities, a place where traditions migrated when they grew tired of scrutiny. The boathouse, when it appeared, was less a ruin than a stage set. Its timbers looked charred but refused to crumble, the blackness of them strangely dry. Frost still clung to the roofline. Icicles dripped not water but tiny beads of resin that caught the pale sun. Lewis muttered that the fire brigade had gone. He had spoken to the watchman who had telephoned the alarm. A man of few adjectives. I stepped out of the car, and the smell hit me first. Not ash, not river, but a faint sweetness, like a perfume forgotten at the back of a drawer. It lingered, above the boards, clung to my coat. Something feminine, old-fashioned, and out of place. The bursar arrived briskly from the college path, rubbing his gloved hands as though to conjure warmth from a cold equation. He spoke about heating bills, the ancient wiring of the boathouse, the petty rivalries of rowing teams. His voice had the tone of minutes read aloud in a meeting. While he spoke, I watched a crow picking at the frozen bank, its beak tapping like a metronome. The bursar's breath steamed, but his words did not. Inside, the boathouse felt like a theater after a matinee, emptied of spectators, but still holding the ghost of applause. Oars lay stacked like accusations. The walls bore no scorch marks near the floor, only higher up, as though the fire had floated. Lewis pointed to a fragment on a nail, half of a red wool scarf, edges curled from heat but unconsumed. He held it gingerly. I asked him to keep it bagged but close. It smelled faintly of the same perfume. On a bench near the window, a newspaper lay folded back to the crossword. Only the top half remained, its edges singed but intact. Several clues were penciled in a sharp, upright hand. One, untouched, red cold flame. The symmetry of the letters struck me. The grid's black squares formed a pattern like a trident pointing inward. I tried a few mental anagrams, but nothing settled. A clue can be a confession, but only when you know the language. Lewis remarked that the bursar seemed more annoyed than alarmed. I told him annoyance is a kind of camouflage. The bursar had mentioned heating bills twice in one breath. He had also said something else. That the boathouse was locked the night before, yet he had used the present tense about its contents. People betray themselves in grammar more than in tone. I stored it away. The light through the window made the frost outside glow like a negative photograph. I imagined a woman standing there before dawn, her scarf drawn tight, some old scent on her wrists, striking a match not for warmth but for erasure. I could not see her face. Cases often begin as silhouettes. Lewis asked whether I thought it arson. I said only that fire should burn, and this one had not. I brushed my fingers across the crossword margin. The pencil lead had indented the paper without breaking it, heavy enough to show pressure but not enough to tear. Someone angry, perhaps, but contained. A hidden pulse. When we stepped back into the cold, the bursar had gone, leaving only a faint set of shoe prints in the frost leading toward the chapel. They were narrow, deliberate, as though placed by someone accustomed to walking in gowns. I watched them fade even as I looked. Lewis started the engine and the car filled with the smell of damp wool. He asked if we should return to the station. I told him not yet. There was something here. In the crossword, in the bursar's tense, in the perfume dissolving into the air, that needed to settle before it would speak. The river moved past us in slow sheets of steel, and I thought of the opera ticket again, waiting at home like a silent witness. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the frost creep into my fingers, and told Lewis to drive. The scarf's red hung in my mind as we pulled away, a muted flare against the monochrome morning, promising nothing, yet hinting at everything. The frost had begun to thaw when I entered the main court of St. Cuthbert's, yet the stones still glistened as if they had been rinsed clean of color. My shoes made a muted sound on the flagging, a kind of private metronome as I crossed beneath the archway toward the porter's lodge. Inside, the air smelled of coal dust and the sweetish tang of old paper, like a library breathing slowly. The porter, heavy with discretion, told me the rowing coach would see me first. He waited in a small panelled room lined with trophies whose silver had dulled to pewter. He was once a celebrated oarsman. The photographs along the wall captured him mid-stroke, face set like a commandment. Now his voice was clipped, his eyes restless, as he spoke of training schedules and disillusioned benefactors. He called the boathouse incident a nuisance, then an outrage, then an inevitable outcome of modern students. While he spoke, I noticed his hands, raw from the cold, but with a faint smear of wax along one knuckle. He had been polishing something, perhaps those same trophies. The smell of polish was there too, faint under the coal. He told me he had locked the boathouse himself the night before. He added that his keyring was heavy enough to be noticed in a man's pocket, but I had already seen it on the table. Small, light, one key missing from its loop. I said nothing. People confess in absences as often as in words. The junior fellow received me in a room bright with uncurtained windows. Books lay open on his desk, not like tools, but like ornaments. Byron's name appeared on several spines, annotated with a young scholar's eagerness. He spoke in graceful sentences about the college's traditions, about how the bursar's parsimony had stifled the rowing club's dinners, about how a certain alumna had once attended such dinners, despite rules to the contrary. His mouth lingered on her name before letting it go. When I asked if he had been to the boathouse recently, he smiled too quickly and said the river had never been his element. A faint scent of river mud clung to his boots. I left him with a polite nod and walked down a corridor whose boards creaked under a runner of faded red. The librarian's office stood at the far end, lit by a single lamp that made the bindings of the books glow like old embers. She rose from her desk with a measured grace. She had written, years ago, a paper on arson in Victorian novels, a fact she mentioned before I had the chance. Her voice was low, nearly a whisper, as though the books themselves demanded it. She said the paper had been more about symbolism than combustion. She said nothing about the boathouse until I did. Then she merely adjusted a pencil on her desk and observed that fires often leave more untouched than consumed. As she spoke, I studied the guest register of the Boathouse Wine Club, which lay open on a side table. Heavy parchment, names written in different hands across decades. One entry had been crossed out twice, a woman's name, elegant and deliberate, yet forbidden by the club's charter. The second crossing was darker than the first, as though made after hesitation. I felt the small thrill of recognition. I'd seen that same looping initial in the diary hidden inside the rowing trophy. No direct proof, only a filament of ink between 2 pages of different lives. The librarian watched me read. Her fingers, pale and unadorned, rested on the back of a chair. She asked whether I believed in patterns or coincidences. I said only that Oxford had taught me to distrust both. When I left her office, the corridor smelled of dust and old rain trapped in the wood. I carried the register's image in my mind, like a watermark. Outside, the thawing court shone with puddles reflecting the towers, and the chapel bell struck a note that felt older than the college itself. 3 conversations, 3 rooms, 3 faintly misaligned stories. Somewhere among them, a red scarf, a cold fire, and a name crossed out twice, waited to form a shape. I walked back across the court slowly, feeling the frost soften under my shoes and thinking how some erasures speak louder than ink. The trophy was heavier than it looked. Lewis had brought it into my office wrapped in a thin sheet of brown paper as though smuggling contraband from a museum. He said he had found it in a cupboard behind the boathouse's disused lockers, wedged behind a row of tarnished cups no one had claimed in years. He placed it on my desk without a word, and for a moment we both regarded its shallow gleam. The silver had dulled to a color between pewter and smoke, the kind of sheen that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. When I lifted it, the base rattled faintly. Lewis tilted his head. I unscrewed the plate, and inside lay a narrow book, its cover the color of dried moss, tied with a faded ribbon. The pages smelled faintly of river damp and lavender. Not a diary in the usual sense, but a sequence of fragments, lines of poetry or something pretending to be poetry, no dates, only initials and a recurring phrase, frosted fire. The words appeared at intervals like a refrain half remembered from a song. I read a few passages aloud, not to Lewis, but to the room. He shifted uneasily and said it felt like reading someone's confession. Perhaps it was. The handwriting changed slightly from page to page, as if written over years or moods. One entry, wings of ice where warmth should be. Another, a match struck underwater, still burning. It was the sort of imagery that tries too hard until one realizes it is not imagery at all. I carried the diary back to St. Cuthbert's and asked for the librarian. Her office smelled of dust and wood polish, of paper breathing under lamplight. She sat behind her desk with the same measured composure as before, fingers interlaced on a stack of catalogues. When I laid the diary on the table, she drew a long breath and said she had hoped it would never surface. She admitted, after a pause long enough to be its own paragraph, that it belonged to a former student, a woman whose name she did not speak. The alumna had vanished after a scandal whispered but never proved. An affair with a don, a dispute over an endowment, a dinner at the wine club she should not have attended. As she spoke, I noticed her gaze shifting not to the diary, but to the window, as if measuring the light. Her hands remained perfectly still except for one thumb brushing the edge of a pencil. People betray themselves in small motions. She said the student had been brilliant, troubled, and fond of puzzles. She said nothing about the phrase frosted fire, though I asked, only that some metaphors belong to their writers alone. I returned to the diary and saw, on a back page, a tiny penciled grid resembling a crossword but without clues, only letters arranged like an unfinished snowflake. In its center, the initials repeated FF. I thought again of the clue cold flame left unsolved in the boathouse newspaper. Frosted fire. Cold flame. The same paradox written 2 ways. Not evidence yet, but a signature of thought. The air in the office felt close, as though the books had drawn nearer. I asked the librarian whether she remembered the alumna's handwriting. She said everyone changes their hand over time. I asked whether the vanished student had ever returned to Oxford under another name. She said Oxford is full of ghosts and sometimes they walk in daylight. When I left her office, the corridor smelt faintly of rain leaking through an old skylight. I held the diary in its ribbon and felt the weight of years compressing into its narrow spine. The past was pressing against the present like a watermark under a careless brush of ink, visible only at a certain angle. Lewis waited at the far end, his coat collar up, and asked if it meant anything yet. I told him not yet, but soon. Some patterns need darkness before they show themselves. The sky had lost its frost by the time I returned to the coach's quarters, yet the river still looked like hammered tin, and the reeds leaned stiffly as if remembering ice. He had sent word to Lewis in a tone both defiant and weary. He wished to make a clean breast of it. That phrase alone set a small bell ringing. People rarely use such words unless they've heard them in someone else's mouth first. Inside his room, the trophies had been pushed to the edges of a low table, their dulled silver forming a narrow amphitheater around a single glass of whiskey. He sat at its center like a man about to recite, not confess. He began without prompting, speaking of budget cuts, of decades of loyal service, of students too pampered to row with discipline. The fire, he said, had been a symbolic act, a warning, nothing more. He had locked the boathouse and lit it himself, waited until the flames rose before walking back across the meadow. Lewis stood in the doorway, arms folded, face neutral. I sat opposite the coach, hands clasped loosely, and listened. His words were orderly, the chronology neat, no faltering in detail, yet the neatness itself was the crack. No one recounts anger with such polished syntax. Even his pauses felt choreographed. He lifted his glass, sipped once, and added almost casually that he had quoted Eliot to himself as the fire caught. Not with a bang, but a whimper. It was then I felt the shift, the student in the street had murmured. Not with a bang, but a whimper, a slip of the tongue, unconscious. The coach now delivered the line correctly, but with a faint hesitation before the last word, as though recalling the proper version at the last moment. A false echo, rehearsed from a corrected script, the symmetry between two misquotes and a perfect one, each slightly off from the other, made a small pattern bloom. Someone had fed him the phrase. I asked him how the fire had looked. He said the flames had curled like white ribbons against the beams. He said the scarf had caught first, red against the blackening wood, but the scarf, when we found it, had been only singed at the edges, its weave intact. I asked again, softly, and this time he glanced at Lewis before answering, as if awaiting a cue. His eyes were red-rimmed but dry. The room smelled faintly of wax polish, the same as on his hands 2 days ago, but no trace of accelerant, no scorched cloth in the bin. He produced a key from his pocket and placed it on the table. It was too new, brass still bright, the college crest unscuffed. The real boathouse key, I knew, was iron and older than either of us. I let silence do its work. He began to speak faster, about betrayal, about how the bursar had cut his stipend, about how no one appreciated the traditions. His words lost their shape, fell into repetition. The rehearsed speech had ended, and now only fragments emerged. He had been at the boathouse, yes, but at dawn, not night. He had smelled perfume, but thought it a trick of the frost. He had seen someone's shadow, but not the face. Lewis shifted his weight, but said nothing. I watched the coach's thumb trace the rim of his glass, round and round, like a man rowing in place. My mind returned to the diary's refrain, frosted fire, and to the crossword clue cold flame. The paradox was everywhere, repeating itself under different guises. When he finally fell silent, the room seemed smaller. He looked at me with a mixture of relief and challenge, as though daring me to disbelieve him. I told him softly that confessions are seldom as clean as the crime, and he looked away. Outside the window, the river moved sluggishly under a low sun, its surface reflecting nothing. We left him there, Lewis and I, stepping back into the corridor where the air smelled of damp coats. Lewis asked if I thought we had our man. I said only that truth rarely arrives rehearsed, and this one had been delivered like a speech at a college dinner. Behind us, the trophies waited in their dull ring, silent witnesses to a performance that had failed to convince its intended audience. I had taken the diary home with me that evening, sliding it between two case files as though hiding a small flame in a coat pocket. My flat smelt faintly of old tobacco and the iron tang of radiator pipes. Outside, rain tapped the window with a sound like cautious fingers. I poured a glass of red wine and set the diary on the table beside it. The ribbon had slackened in transit and lay across the cover like a vein. I began reading without expectation, but the fragments resisted simple sense. They were not mere verses. They arranged themselves like lattice work. Initials at the margins, scattered capitals in the middle of lines, words beginning with the same letter in measured intervals. After several pages, I saw it. Each stanza's first letters spelled a sequence, not a phrase. Numbers hidden in the shapes of letters. A date, perhaps. When I penciled them in the margin, they formed a rhythm, 17-2-C. At first it meant nothing. Then I noticed the repetition of the word frost in the lines corresponding to February entries, and the letter C appearing only after every seventh line. A pattern of weeks, a marker of place. The cipher pointed not backward but forward, to a day next week. I sat back and let the wine warm my throat. The flat hummed with its own quiet, broken only by the occasional drip in the kitchen. Out of habit, my eyes strayed to the opera ticket pinned above the mantel. Its date was already past. The seat had stayed empty. Something about that emptiness echoed the diary's code. Time reserved, but unused. The telephone rang once and then stopped. Lewis had left a message earlier, a brief note on my desk at the station. Boathouse stored more than oars. Call me. I thought about it now. Secret endowment, financial records, a boathouse as vault, the college bursar guarding his ledgers under the guise of sport, the woman's perfume lingering where numbers had been hidden. I turned back to the diary, flipping to the last page where a small grid, half crossword, half snowflake, waited. The central letters formed FF again, but the outer ring spelled ASH, then NOT. Ash not. A negation, a refusal. Cold fire, frosted flame. It felt less like verse and more like a warning, but to whom? On my desk lay the photocopy of the librarian's old paper on Victorian arson. I had brought it home absent-mindedly. I leafed through the footnotes, scanning for nothing in particular, until one citation caught me. A journal article about symbolic fires in collegiate architecture, citing St. Cuthbert's by name. I read the footnote twice, my finger tracing the line as though feeling the grain of wood. The page number was wrong by one digit, a small discrepancy, the kind a careless editor makes or a careful one plants. When corrected, the number pointed to an appendix of building plans, not to any literary analysis at all. I poured a second glass of wine and let it sit untouched. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist. In my mind, the cipher and the footnote lay side by side like two halves of a map. A date concealed in poetry, a blueprint hidden in scholarship. I thought of the librarian's hands, perfectly still except for that one thumb brushing the pencil. A gesture repeated unconsciously whenever she spoke of the vanished alumna, as if she were erasing and rewriting the same name under invisible headings. I tried to picture the boathouse again, its false fire, the scarf, the scent. If the diary predicted a date, then something was planned, not remembered. Perhaps another fire, perhaps an unveiling, or simply a meeting arranged by codes long familiar to those involved. The wine had grown cool. I closed the diary and held it for a moment, feeling its damp spined weight. In the dim light, the ribbon's frayed edge looked almost like a fuse. I thought of calling Lewis, but did not. Some patterns reveal themselves only when left to settle, like silt at the bottom of a glass. In the silence, I heard the rain resume, softer than before. I leaned back, eyes on the opera ticket, and murmured the ciphered date under my breath. It hung in the room like a promise, neither made nor broken, a small arrangement of numbers waiting to become an event. The committee room was high-ceilinged and faintly sepulchral, its windows crusted with the residue of old rain. I arrived late, my steps softened by the Persian runner that swallowed sound like a confidant. A fire had been laid in the grate but not lit, so the air carried only the smell of coal and damp wool. Rows of chairs faced the long oak table. One of them, at the far end, sat empty but not vacant. A faint depression in the cushion, the armrest still glossy with the warmth of a recently lifted hand. The bursar's chair. Lewis hovered at the back, murmuring that the bursar had left moments before my arrival. Some urgent call, the clerk had said. Yet the coat on the rack remained, its pocket bulged by a ledger's outline. The absence felt staged. I let my palm rest on the chair's edge. Still warm, almost human. It is a strange intimacy, touching heat left behind. A junior lecturer was speaking at the table, his voice dry as parchment. Budget lines, endowment flows, ice damage to the boathouse roof. He said something in passing, funds being laundered through frost, and the phrase settled in me like grit. No one else seemed to notice. The words might have been a joke, but his eyes flickered toward the empty chair as he spoke. A slip of tone, a private signal perhaps, offered and withdrawn. I stood near the window, pretending to read the agenda while my ears followed the room. The clock ticked heavily, a rhythm against which voices rose and fell. A minor clerk shuffled papers at the sideboard. She bent close to me as if to adjust a teacup and whispered that an envelope had turned up in the bursar's drawer. Sealed, addressed in a woman's hand, but never posted. She said it smelled faintly of perfume, then glanced over her shoulder and straightened the cups. Her whisper left a trace of breath on the cold air. The red scarf flashed in my mind without invitation. Not a memory, but an after-image. Its singed edge, its stubborn scent above the waterlogged boards. In the diary, frost and fire entwined like twin strands of a code. Here in the committee room, the bursar's absence, the unposted letter, the odd phrase about laundering. All of it lay under a thin crust of routine like ice over dark water. I asked the clerk softly if she had read the name on the envelope. She said only that the script was elegant, old-fashioned, perhaps the same as in the guest register. Her fingers trembled as she set down the sugar tongs. I noticed a faint smear of red on her cuff, ink or lipstick, and stored it away without comment. The discussion at the table turned to heating bills. Numbers recited, agreed upon, minuted. The lecturer who had uttered the phrase about frost now rubbed his temple with a pencil, leaving a small grey crescent on the skin. I watched him carefully. He avoided the bursar's coat as he left, slipping his own papers into a folder embossed with the college crest. His shoes left a pattern of melted frost on the floorboards, dark ovals that evaporated as I watched. When the meeting dispersed, I remained alone for a moment. The fire still unlit, the chairs pushed back, the agenda sheets curling at the edges. The bursar's seat had cooled but held a shape, a ghost of posture. I thought of the ciphered date hidden in the diary and of the footnote leading to building plans. A meeting predicted, a transaction disguised. Frost as cover, fire as signal. Lewis returned, carrying a folder of minutes. He asked whether I had learned anything. I told him only that warmth lingers longer than truth. We stepped out into the corridor where the floorboards creaked like old timbers at tide. The smell of paper and damp stone followed us. Behind the closed door, the empty chair waited, cooling into anonymity, while the red scarf's image burned quietly in my mind like an ember under snow. I went to the junior fellow's rooms at dusk, when the quad had begun to glow with the wet shine of evening and the chapel bells rang like distant glass. His staircase smelled of damp stone and the faint sweetness of spilled sherry. Through an open window came the muffled hum of undergraduates rehearsing some choral piece, the notes hesitant as though aware of my errand. He received me with a smile pitched between courtesy and performance. He had prepared his papers on the desk like a stage set. Lecture notes, train tickets, even a program folded to display the date. He said he had been at a talk in Cambridge on the night of the boathouse fire, a colloquium on Byron's early satires. He added, almost idly, that the lecturer had opened with a remark about cold flames of inspiration. The phrase slipped out too neatly. It landed on my ear like a feather dipped in ink. I took the papers in my hands, scanning without haste. The train ticket showed a departure later than he claimed, and the lecture's printed announcement gave a start time that could not have matched his arrival. The gap was small but real, 20 minutes unaccounted for, enough to stand at the riverbank and watch a building smolder without heat. I asked him about it in a voice deliberately bland. He replied that the timetable had changed at the last moment, that there had been a delay, that his memory of the evening was clear despite the discrepancy. His fingers, I noticed, rested on the edge of his desk as though holding it still. Lewis, poking about with the unhurried air of a man looking for a misplaced pen, opened a wardrobe and found a scarf folded neatly beside a row of shirts. Red wool, identical to the one salvaged from the boathouse but without scorch or scent. He held it up like a question. The fellow laughed, saying the club had sold them years ago as rowing mementos. He said anyone could have one. He said the signed scarf must belong to someone else. His words tumbled too quickly, a stream curving to avoid stones. The room's air shifted as we stood there. Rain on the sill, the smell of old books. A faint note of perfume that did not match the fellow's cologne. He poured himself a glass of water. Steady-handed, but the rim touched his lip before he realized it was empty. I stored the moment away. Small lapses often tell larger truths. I glanced at his lecture notes again. Margins annotated with lines from Byron, but one quotation misattributed to a later poem. Not error, but habit. He had made the same slip in conversation with me days earlier. And on the reverse of one page, a doodle. A grid of squares resembling a crossword, the letters C and F alternating in diagonal pattern. Cold flame again, refracted through habit or obsession. Lewis folded the scarf and returned it to the shelf without comment. We left the fellow in his curated room, his smile still in place but fraying at the edges. As I descended the staircase, the boards creaked like old timbers. I felt the diary's cipher pressing at my thoughts, the bursar's warm chair, the unposted envelope, each piece small, separate, but beginning to form the outline of a shape too fragile to name. Outside, the rain had stopped. The quad smelled of wet stone and extinguished candles. I paused under an archway and corrected the timetable in my head, counting minutes backward from the lecture's advertised start. The gap held, stubborn as ink, an alibi, cold enough to pass inspection yet, beginning to melt under touch. Lewis asked if we had caught him in a lie. I said only that some scarves are meant to be found, others to mislead. We walked toward the gate, our footsteps leaving dark patches on the flagstones that vanished almost as soon as they formed, as if the college itself preferred erasure to revelation. The photograph reached me folded inside a manila envelope, the kind used for committee minutes or lost receipts. No note, only the image itself. A May ball at St. Cuthbert's some 30 years earlier, printed on glossy paper now dulled by handling. I carried it to the window of my flat and let the pale afternoon light fall across it. The scene was almost theatrical. Lanterns strung between stone arches, gowns pale against the darker suits, champagne glasses raised like muted signals. At first the faces were a blur of collegiate self-satisfaction, yet one by one they surfaced. There was the bursar, younger, hair still black, but already with that clerical squint of someone reading numbers too closely. Beside him, the librarian, not yet confined to whispers, her smile tilted as though masking a private verdict. and between them a woman whose name I had not heard spoken but whose handwriting I had traced across diary pages and guest registers. The vanished alumna, the red scarf's first wearer, the cipher's silent author. Her expression held none of the evening's gaiety. It was not unhappiness, exactly. More a concentration turned inward, as if the music and light had been arranged for someone else. In the crook of her arm she held a program folded into thirds, and at her wrist a slim bracelet glinted like a dash of Morse code. I poured myself a small measure of whiskey and sat at my desk. The opera ticket still lay pinned above the mantel, its date now far behind me. I looked at it and thought of other evenings never attended. A woman waiting at a restaurant table, a phone call unanswered, the way regret becomes a second pulse beneath daily life. The photograph trembled slightly in my hand, whether from the drink or from the weight of recognition. I took out a magnifying glass. The shadows behind the three figures were strangely sharp, as though lit from a flashbulb off to one side. In the negative spaces, the black between lantern strings, the pattern of ivy climbing the wall, small shapes emerged. I had seen them before, not as pictures but as numbers hidden in initials. The cipher from the diary had spelled out a date. Here, inverted by the photograph's flash, the ivy leaves and shadowed panes formed that same pattern, 17-2-C, the same rhythm, the date not of a past ball but of a coming night. I leaned closer until the glass misted with my breath. The alumna's folded program bore a crest on its back, but half obscured by her fingers. A crest I had glimpsed only once, on the bursar's private stationery. The connection was not proof, but it clicked into place like a final word in a crossword. I murmured the letters under my breath, tasting them like a refrain. Outside, Oxford's bells began a slow sequence of notes. Rain ticked at the window, not hard, just enough to blur the edges of spires and chimneys. I thought again of the bursar's warm chair, of the envelope never posted, of the junior fellow's train ticket, all of it an arrangement of absences around one unseen presence. Lewis had left a message that he was following a lead at the river. I imagined him in the drizzle, collar up, boots sinking into the sodden bank. For a moment I envied his straightforwardness, his belief in facts as stones one can step upon. Mine were shadows and echoes, photographs in negative. I set the glass down and traced the cipher once more across the diary's margin. Date, place, perhaps a time. The pattern in the photograph confirmed it, but also unsettled me. It was not a clue dropped carelessly, but a signature left deliberately, like a breath on glass. Someone wanted to be found, or feared, or both. The whiskey had gone warm. I stared at the opera ticket, its ink fading under the pin, and thought of the woman's face in the photograph. Her eyes not on the camera, but somewhere just beyond, where the lantern light ended. A space reserved, but unused. In that moment, I felt the case shift from puzzle to something more intimate, a recognition of the distance between what is planned and what is lived. I placed the photograph beside the diary and turned off the lamp. In the dimness, the reversed shadow still seemed to glimmer, the cipher hovering like frost over dark water. The bells stopped. Only the rain remained, soft against the pane, marking time until the date arrived. The night came on as the diary had foretold, a pale February evening edged with the smell of thawing reeds and wood smoke from distant houses. Lewis and I stood back from the boathouse, our breath misting in faint clouds, the river behind us a black mirror that refused reflection. The frost had begun to creep in again, whitening the grass underfoot. Each step felt like treading on brittle glass. I thought of the cipher hidden in the alumna's poems, the photograph's inverted shadows, and of how certain dates arrive whether one attends to them or not. Like an opera ticket pinned above a mantel, waiting for a man who will not go. The boathouse sat hunched at the water's edge, its roof patched with frost, its timbers dark but not scorched. A low lamp glimmered inside. We had waited since dusk, saying little. Lewis shifted once and muttered that the cold had teeth. I answered without turning that it was better to feel it now than later. In truth, my fingers had gone numb around the small notebook where I had sketched the ciphered date. The numbers looked like a row of silent faces. At last, the bursar arrived, coat collar up, moving with the slow certainty of someone who thinks the night is empty. He carried no torch. The door opened with a sound like a sigh and closed again behind him. Through a gap in the boards, we saw him kneel and lift a section of the floor as easily as a man folding a page. Beneath lay a cache of ledgers bound in dark leather, their edges worn soft by many readings. He stacked them into a canvas bag with careful hands, not a thief's haste, but an accountant's ritual. Lewis glanced at me, question in his eyes. I shook my head. Watching the bursar, I noticed the absence of gloves despite the cold and the small pack of chemical coolant tucked beside him, the same type used to char wood without flame. He reached for it, unsealing the pouch. A faint hiss rose, a mist of cold clung to his fingers. This had been the fire's trick from the start, not destruction, but a simulation of it, a frost masquerading as burn. A figure moved at the edge of the lamplight. The librarian stepped forward, her hair pinned differently but her posture unmistakable. She did not look surprised to see the bursar. She knelt beside him, taking a ledger and slipping it into her own bag. Her face was calm, almost tender, as though enacting a long-rehearsed gesture. In that moment, I saw both the vanished alumna and the present librarian inhabiting the same outline, one name overlaying another like ink on palimpsest. We entered quietly. Lewis's boots made a hollow sound on the boards. The bursar started but did not flee. His hands stayed on the ledger as if it might anchor him. He spoke of safeguarding the college, of endowments hidden from predatory committees, of preserving tradition. He said the coach's confession was proof of guilt, that the junior fellow's absence at the fire sealed the case. Each phrase was polished, like a financial statement read aloud. But the chemical packs at his feet told another story. I asked him why the scarf smelled of perfume. He blinked once, then looked at the librarian. She said nothing. Her eyes flicked to the diary tucked under my arm, then to the ledger in her bag. I thought of the unposted envelope, the bursar's warm chair, the phrase about laundering through frost. A pattern emerged, but refused to resolve, like a crossword whose final square remains blank no matter how many times one checks the letters. Lewis retrieved the chemical packs and set them aside. The frost on the floor began to melt under the lamplight. I told the bursar softly that numbers can be hidden, but not erased. He looked down, fingers tightening on the ledger until his knuckles went white. The librarian stood very still, her hands at her sides. She was not dead. She had only changed her name, stepping from one role into another as easily as a dancer crossing a stage. Complicit, yes, but in which direction? Toward concealment or revelation? I could not yet tell. Outside, the river made its slow winter sound. The lamplight flickered, casting their two shadows onto the far wall where the beams formed a grid like another crossword, unsolved. I felt no triumph, only the ache of inevitability, as if we had arrived at a scene long prepared for us. Later, when the ledgers were sealed and statements taken, I stood on the bank alone. Frost glittered on the reeds like a pale embroidery. The opera ticket waited at home, still pinned, still unused. I murmured the cipher's date under my breath, and it dissolved into the night air. The river moved on, carrying nothing visible, only a memory of a fire without heat and a woman who had never quite vanished. I found her in the upper reading room just before dusk, the tall windows darkening like unpolished mirrors. The lamps had not yet been lit, so the smell of paper and old bindings rose without interruption, dry and faintly sweet. She was sitting at the long oak table where generations of students had copied notes and written hesitant first lines. Her coat lay folded beside her, one glove on top like a marker in a book. She did not feign surprise when I approached. She looked up and said that she had been expecting this visit. Her voice carried the same softness as before, but lacked its scaffolding. Each word seemed to land without rehearsal. She gestured at the empty chair opposite her. I sat and felt the grain of the wood under my palms, the chair still warm from the last reader. She began before I asked, saying the bursar had been stealing from an endowment meant for women who could not otherwise afford a place at St. Cuthbert's. She had discovered the ledger years ago while cataloguing committee papers and had written the diary as a code, a record no one would recognize except those who had shared the old wine club's evenings. She said she had once loved the missing alumna, then smiled without humor and added that she had been the missing alumna all along. She had taken a new name, a new post, and waited. Her eyes drifted to the high shelves as she spoke of waiting. She said she had burned the past coldly, as the boathouse had been burned, not to destroy, but to reveal. The scarf had been left as a sign, the crossword as a whisper. She spoke without ornament, like a confession written in pencil on lined paper. I watched her hands. They were folded loosely on the table, thumb tracing the edge of a glove. In that small movement lay the echo of every other time she had touched a pencil while speaking to me. I thought of the diary's refrain, frosted fire, and realized it was not a lament, but a description of her plan. Lewis waited at the door. He shifted once and asked in his mild way whether she was ready to come with us. She nodded, but did not rise. She asked if I believed her motives pure. I said nothing. Sympathy flickered, but stayed contained, like a match struck in a draught. She looked at me for a long moment, eyes clear but unguarded. Then she gathered her coat and gloves with a quiet grace and walked to the door. Lewis stepped aside, his hand only lightly touching her arm. No struggle, no words. The creak of the corridor swallowed their footsteps. I remained at the table. The high reading room had grown dim, the shelves receding into shadow. On the desk before me lay the opera ticket I had brought unconsciously in my pocket, folded along its old crease. I had intended to use it weeks ago, before the case began to occupy my evenings. Its date was now a relic. The telephone on the side table rang. A muted sound under the high ceiling. Stranger's voice arrived, brisk and faintly apologetic. "Another case," he said, something needing my attention immediately. I answered briefly and hung up. The room was still. Outside, the first flakes of snow drifted past the window, small and uncertain. I looked at the ticket one last time, then placed it between the diary's pages where the cipher had begun. The paper held a faint warmth from my hand. In that quiet moment, I felt the echo of her story and of my own small failures, the missed music, the empty seat. And then I rose to follow Lewis into the corridor, where the smell of old stone met the cold evening air. The case had folded in on itself by the time February bled into March, yet the river still carried its slow bruise of winter. I walked alone down the path toward Port Meadow at dusk, coat collar up, the damp air holding the scent of silt and wood smoke. Where the boathouse had once crouched, the ground lay bare, a rectangle of paler earth at the edge of the water, as if a building had been erased but not forgotten. The frost was coming early that evening. It crept along the reeds like pale handwriting, each blade tipped with a glint of glass. The Thames darkened under the low sky, its surface an unbroken sheet except for the faint ripple of a swan. I stood at the bank and listened. No voices, no creak of oarlocks, only the muffled crackle of ice forming along the mud. I thought of Lewis walking the corridor with the librarian statement in his hand, of the bursar staring at his ledgers as if numbers might defend him. The coach back in his quarters, polishing trophies no longer his. Each had played a part, but the pattern was still incomplete. like a crossword with one square left blank, daring me to guess. I took the opera ticket from my pocket, now soft from being folded and refolded, its ink blurred by the fog. The date had passed weeks ago, yet I had carried it through interviews, stakeouts, even the boathouse itself. A token of evening's mist, of music unheard. In the lamplight of my flat I had once imagined attending, but the case had grown around me like ivy around stone. The river's edge gave off a faint metallic smell. Across the water a single lamp flickered in a college window, its reflection trembling and then steadying. I remembered her face in the photograph, the bracelet glinting like code, the folded program in her hand. She had engineered the deception not out of malice, but something colder, a kind of justice denied sunlight. She had burned the past with ice, and I had let Lewis take her away. I murmured the Eliot line under my breath, the corrected one, tasting its cadence, not with a bang, but a whimper. The word felt heavier now, stripped of lecture halls and student slips, a sound closer to exhalation than to speech. Whether justice or irony had prevailed, I could not tell. Perhaps both. Oxford is hospitable to paradox. The frost reached the water, sketching thin lines along its edge. A small wind lifted and laid them down again. I slipped the ticket back into my pocket, but felt it begin to dissolve under the fog's dampness, paper softening into pulp. In some small way it was a relief, like returning a borrowed thing long kept. A train sounded faintly from the north, a single note carried across the meadow. I thought of the junior fellow's fabricated timetable, of how minutes can be bent but not erased. I thought of the librarian's thumb brushing her pencil, of the bursar's empty chair still warm. All of it now behind me, yet lingering as frost lingers on stone after sunrise. The swan moved off, leaving a faint wake. I stood a while longer, watching the dark water hold its silence. Then I turned away, footsteps muffled on the frozen path, and whispered to no one in particular, the fire was cold. She was not.